If you don't know that much about jazz, you may be surprised to hear that the greatest jazz piano player ever was a Canadian who lived a good chunk of his life in Mississauga, Ontario. Oscar Peterson has been described as Canada's gift to the world because, plain and simple, he tickled those 88 keys better than anyone. There's a new documentary about his life. It debuted at the Toronto International Film Festival. It's called Oscar Peterson, Black and White. And joining us now, both in Ontario's capital city, the filmmaker, Barry Avrich, there he is on the left, and Rosemary Sadlier, former president of the Ontario Black History Society, who's also in the documentary. And it's great to welcome you two to TVO tonight. I saw the documentary. It's absolutely spectacular. And let's start with a little clip off the top showing everybody some of Barry's work. If you would, Sheldon.
You can't talk about jazz in the middle of the 20th century without understanding what a phenomenon Oscar Peterson was.
Oh, he's so good. Barry, Oscar's been dead for 14 years. Why was this the right time to reconsider his legacy?
It's always time. I mean, how many stamps do we have to give people after they've passed away, or post-mortem legacy plays like this? I just feel that I had to keep reminding the world that if there's a Mount Rushmore of jazz, that Oscar Peterson should be on it. I keep falling in love with his music. I think also on a personal note, Steve, my mother, who's on the threshold of turning 93, introduced me to Oscar and several other great, brilliant jazz artists, and feeling reflective about her. And I just wanted to celebrate Oscar again.
Did you know him personally?
I did not know him personally. My mother took me to see him at the Place des Arts in Montreal when I was 11. I didn't even know he was from Montreal. We met in passing, but I did not know him. But certainly my mission in making this film with brilliant people like Rosemary and others was to reintroduce the world to Oscar yet again.
Rosemary, the title of the film is very clever. Oscar Peterson, Black and White. How many different ways can we interpret the title of the film?
The symbolism of black and white. Well, first of all, I think in terms of just the keys themselves on the piano, which were such a significant part of Oscar's experience, but actually the collaboration that he was able to form with people that helped him in his musical journey, whether they were people that he insisted on playing with that happened to be non-Black, but perhaps most importantly, his connection to Norman Granz, who really helped to facilitate his entry into the world stage of music and jazz.
Barry, do you want to pick up that part of the story? How he got together with Norman Granz, who really introduced him to a much bigger audience than he might have otherwise had. How did all that happen?
Norman is one of those, again, untold stories as well. Probably one of the great impresarios and promoters in the world. Norman believed that jazz needed to be elevated as an art form from the smoky, dirty nightclubs, underground nightclubs, and take jazz to another level, which he started to produce these concerts at Lincoln Center and other great halls in the world. And he happened to be in Vancouver, was told that there was this brilliant young prodigy named Oscar Peterson, listened to his music, dismissed it mistakenly, and then happened to be in Montreal on his way to the airport. And this brilliant piece of music came onto the radio, and he said to the taxi driver, "Who's that?" And he said, "Well, that's Oscar Peterson. He's at the Alberta Lounge right now. Take me there right now." And off Norman went, fell in love with Oscar, and the two of them together, black and white, brilliant, genius, just really opened up the world to Oscar Peterson, as he did to the world of jazz for people that needed to see another form of music that had been so suppressed in a lot of ways.
Rosemary, do you know whether Oscar thought of himself as a great jazz pianist or a great Black jazz pianist?
That's a really good question. And to be honest, I think that he thought of himself as both. Whether, as a person of African origin who happens to be Canadian, you don't always think about race until you're confronted with what it means when you run up against barriers or restrictions. Certainly, he would have been aware of what it meant for his father and the nature of the employment that was possible for him to get. Certainly, it might have been part of his concept about what should he do with his musical ability, given the reality of where he might be able to excel, and make it something that would help him take care of himself in the future. But I think that it's also just those other encounters where being a Black person impacted him in a negative or surprising way, that he would have to have thought of himself as Black. You don't ever, as a Black person, not think of yourself as Black, but it's how people treat you and what's the impact of your Blackness on your surroundings.
We'll follow up on that more in just a moment. Barry, I've got to ask you this. I think from the time he was a young teenager, he was over 200 pounds. And of course, by the time he became a worldwide phenomenon, let's just put it this way. He's a very big guy. How does a big man like that play so fast?
Well, we've seen other great artists with great girth as well have this insane ability to transcend whoever they are, whatever size they might be. Oscar had an appetite for life, and he had the same kind of voracious appetite for music and playing. It was just, nobody had ever seen those hands play. His deal that he had obviously sold his soul to the devil, as people said, it was just spectacular playing. And he often said his hands felt like butterflies, whereas the rest of his body did not on that end of it. But just an amazing, amazing consummate musician. I'd never seen anything like it.
And you've got somebody quoted in the film as saying, "I could hear 4 notes and I'd know it was him." How so?
Well, I mean, there was an Oscar sound. There was an Oscar style without that. The way he attacked keyboard. I had looked at other musicians, some great musicians over the years who just basically smashed the piano keys. He was different. I mean, he was mathematical. He was an academic. He was a historian himself and a brilliant musician who really understand the syncopation of each key and what it meant to play. And so you saw, the minute you heard an Oscar composition, you knew it was him. And it wasn't always 1,000 miles an hour. Even his more somber pieces still had a certain style, but you knew it was Oscar.
Let's circle back now to the point Rosemary was making earlier, which is that Oscar obviously never found himself in a circumstance where he wouldn't be seen as a Black piano player. And to that end, let's show a clip from the documentary, and then we'll come back and chat. Shelton, if you would.
I think the worst moment of my life was when I saw true racial hatred for the first time.
How did that make you feel?
Mad.
Devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our body is heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the city. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only.
Rosemary, he obviously played a lot of concerts in the deep south of the United States in what were essentially apartheid-like circumstances. Can you tell us some of what he had to endure during his professional life down there?
I was reminded of his attempt to enter a taxi cab. And because the taxi was apparently for whites only, he was prevented. He was threatened with a gun if he tried to enter. It was actually for him and for Ella Fitzgerald. that kind of thing, or people not being able to stay at hotels together as an ensemble, even though they could travel together as an ensemble. I think that one of the things that really touched him the most, because it was so unexpected, he had somebody come up to him who told him how very much they appreciated his music, how much it meant to him. And when Oscar extended his hand in a usual gesture, and of course this is pre-COVID, the man refused to shake his hand and used the N-word to justify his actions.
Okay, Barry, follow up on that if you would, because Rosemary mentioned the fact there that he would be touring with other group members in the Deep South. For example, Ray Brown was his bass player. Ray Brown was black, but Herbie Ellis was his guitar player, and Herbie was white. So how did they deal with accommodation and all of that under those circumstances?
Well, it was terrible. I mean, we had seen a lot of this in the film Green Book, and I wasn't aware of this until I saw that film in terms of the way musicians were treated through the South. We're always, many of us are aware of huge racial prejudice during that time and today on that end of it. But Oscar and Norman were pioneers, and it was, Norman who helped Oscar put together these brilliant musicians and suggests that it didn't matter what they were, who they looked like, where they came from. It just was about the sum of all parts, which is what Oscar believed in, an incredibly generous musician. But as they would go, they were forced to stay in different hotels. Oscar could be playing in a beautiful hotel in the Deep South that Norman had rented for a concert and still not be allowed to use the bathroom in that building and be told there's an outhouse in the back. And this was incredibly depressing for Oscar, who wanted to share his music with an audience and get to know them as well and feel that. So it was painful for him, which is ultimately what, inspired him to freedom. And it was really, Rosemary, as I was sitting and interviewing her on the stages of Kerner Hall in Toronto, something that she said lit it up for me in terms of making sure that Hymn to Freedom was not only an homage to Oscar's song and to his inspiration from Martin Luther King, but the fact that it's still happening today. And I said to Rosemary at one point, have things really changed? And she said, well, what do you think? And it was at that point that I said that Hymn to Freedom montage has to be a mixture of Breonna and George Floyd and others to really say, have things really changed? Oscar's song still resonates today.
There's that moment in the documentary, Rosemary, where he's asked, how did all this make you feel? And his answer was mad. Do we know whether or not Oscar ever found himself in a set of circumstances where he just couldn't take it anymore and he lashed out or fought back or something like that?
I think that when he was traveling in the States, he certainly had the intervention and the support of Norman Granz and others. But I think that it was later in his life when he had a very unexpected encounter in Mississauga with some racial commentary being directed at him, being harassed, that he really got upset and he had to address it in a different way. And so here he is in the golden years of his life, not necessarily on the public stage, minding his business and still having to deal with racist taunts and commentary.
I should do a follow-up with you on that because, of course, all the people watching this who are from Canada would like to think that we're a kinder, gentler society, and most of the awful racism that he would have dealt with would have been in the Deep South of the United States. But I should ask you, is that in fact the case?
Racism is racism is racism. And, I think that we want to believe that we're better. We're different, slightly. Racism continues here just like it continues in the United States because we're formed from the same seeds, the seeds of the transatlantic slave trade, the seeds of the structures that were created as a following that. And while it seems like a long time ago, those seeds of inequity continue, and they also inform how we view people of African origin. I think that, it's harder, I think, for Canadians to accept it because they don't always see the Black population, or they want to believe that they are different. But the reality is that the Black population, whether it was small or larger as it's become now more recently, there's still some challenges in terms of how the Black population is treated or perceived. And this is something that absolutely our artists as well experience.
Barry, let me take you back to his teenage years. He actually played Carnegie Hall when he was 17 years old. How did that come about?
Well, Norman, it's again back to Norman Granz, who said, "I think it's time for the big time for you." And it was a very short runway with Norman, but he knew that he had a superstar here, and so he put him on the bill at Carnegie Hall, unannounced, unadvertised. Literally threw him out there, and by then Oscar had been playing in front of live audiences and was not nervous. He was, just incredible powerhouse. He believed in what he can play without being arrogant. And out he went onto that stage. There's a recording of it in the film, and the audience, who had certainly not heard of him in New York just yet, completely falls in love with him, because you're just seeing a star. A shooting star right there on that stage. And then I don't think I don't think Oscar can ever look back at that point. Norman gives him that litmus test on that stage and says, "Okay, I've got the goods here," and then literally brings him to the greatest concert halls in the world.
So he did knock it out of the park.
He did knock it out of the park, yes.
Okay.
As somebody in the film refers to him as, the Michael Jordan of piano playing. And again, Steve, if you see the people that we've lined up for the film on that end of it, from Billy Joel to Herbie Hancock to young John Baptiste, who's just won the Oscar, you see the influence of Oscar Peterson on these musicians right through their entire career, and it's quite extraordinary.
I was going to ask you, Barry, how the heck did you get Billy Joel in this picture?
Well, I think two things favored me. One, that it was COVID and he wasn't touring. And it literally took one phone call, and I knew that Billy Joel had a connection to Oscar, and so literally he said, "Okay, how about tomorrow?"
And that's how it happened? You literally went the next day?
Went the next day to Sag Harbor, and he didn't even give me an address. Said, "I'm the house near the water, and you'll find it." So we got to town. It's a funny story. We got to town and ran into a gentleman running to be the next mayor of Sag Harbor. And he said, "What are you doing in town?" I said, "Well, why don't you vote for me?" I said, "I'm not from here, but do you know where Billy Joel lives?" He goes, "Oh, yeah, it's right around the corner and just down the lane."
That's great. I have a short but complicated question for you, Barry. 4 marriages. How come?
Well, everybody looks for the scandal in all of these documentaries. I think in Oscar's life, there was really no scandal in terms of, drugs or alcohol, the typical, things that you see when artists are touring. As he's very candid and open about that in the movie on that end of it. It's tough to live with a musician who's so driven and who would never say no. I mean, keep in mind, Steve, this is so critical that, aside from his own discography, there's another 200 albums that he performed on for other artists because he just never said no. And I have a late great friend who used to say that, his work is his wife and his wife is his mistress. And that was the case with Oscar, in that, his work came first, and, and those marriages suffered as a result of that. But the last one seemed to work. Kelly Peterson is in the film, and she's fabulous. And they did have a great marriage in his Act 3.
Rosemary, I introduced this segment by saying he was the greatest jazz piano player of all time. I mean, essentially, no questions asked, the debate is over. Maybe I shouldn't have done that, but, well, you tell me. Who was better? Was anybody better?
Oh, gosh. No. For the purposes of this interview, of course not. But I think that what makes him stand out is because he's one of the first. He's really the first one that Canada can claim as its own, native-grown, nurtured, trained jazz musician. And so that's what makes him the best.
And there's a great statue to him in Ottawa, right? Near the National Arts Center?
Yes. And of course, there's And he's also marked in terms of places in Mississauga, if I'm not mistaken, as well as Montreal. So he's, and that in addition to all the Grammys he was able to amass.
Now, Barry, I want to ask you about the experience of having this film that you've made about Oscar Peterson be shown at TIFF, the Toronto International Film Festival. What was that experience like for you?
Well, look, I was incredibly honored to have a film accepted at the Toronto Film Festival, as one always is as a filmmaker. I think much like Oscar's own feelings about his acceptance into Canada and acceptance within Canada as Canadians, and I always say this, we're not super great at honoring our own, which is why I continue to make films about Canadians. I think, again, happy to be at the Toronto Film Festival. This film ultimately should have been in Roy Thompson Hall at the Princess Theatre, Princess Wales Theatre. At the end of the day, I mean, it was at TIFF Bell Lightbox. It was fine, but why does a film like Dionne Warwick and Made by Americans end up as a gala, whereas Oscar's like, yeah, okay, it was a good film, let's show it at TIFF. So I don't want to. It's not sour grapes. I just feel that again, as Canadians, we have to keep pushing. Alanis Morissette, great artist, a gala, a film made by Americans. Here's a Canadian film made by Canadians about easily one of the greatest Canadian musicians ever. So it should have, I think, been a little bit more elevated in where it played within the programming. Thank you, Rosemary. But, again, I'm happy it had its world premiere there. We had a sold-out audience, and Jackie Richardson, who sings Hymn to Freedom, a 5-minute standing ovation. And so, you can't get better than that.
Did you have that conversation with the folks who programmed TIFF and asked them why you were in the Bell Lightbox instead of one of the bigger venues?
I certainly did, and we pushed, and I think they always feel that me and my team are lobbing them too hard, and they basically said, oh, not available, not available. But I think we know the answer.
Barry, for those who didn't see it at TIFF but who want to see it now, where can they?
They can watch Oscar Peterson Black and White on Crave.
Well, I got to tell you, Barry, you're one of this country's finest documentary filmmakers. I don't think there's any debate about that. You knocked this baby out of the park. This was absolutely a fantastic piece of work. I learned so much, not only about Oscar, the piano player, but all the crap he had to go through in his life as well, which was so instrumental to who he was inside. So thank you for making the film. Rosemary, thank you for being in it. And thank you to both of you for being on TVO tonight to talk about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.